Hey everybody, it's Jay, and today I have three Geissele triggers in front of me that I thought it would be interesting to do a comparison on. The B-GRF, which stands for Brownells Geissele Rapid Fire, the SSP, which stands for Super Speed Precision, and the S3G, which stands for Super 3 Gun. Now, most websites that you go to buy a trigger from will list these as single stage, and that's a pretty accurate description. One of them is classified by Geissele as a hybrid trigger, which is the S3G. And basically they say that is a combination of a two-stage and a single stage. In practice, it's a lot closer to a single stage than a two-stage, and I'll explain why when I get to that trigger. Now, two-stage means that the trigger, there is some take-up in the trigger, you pull up some slack before you hit a solid wall, and then a more gentle pull will cause the trigger to break. Not break as in malfunction, but cause the hammer to go forward and the firing mechanism to go off in the gun. That gives you very predictable, very easily moderated shot placement when you're shooting longer range. But if you're shooting closer range, and if your goal is more to shoot fast and have more accurate follow-up shots at closer range, most people prefer single stage triggers. And that's typically where I lean on triggers, is single stage triggers for most of my guns, especially ones that don't have scopes. So, starting off with the Brownells Geissele Rapid Fire, this is the first trigger that I ever bought for myself, the first custom trigger that I ever got, and I put it in my first ever AR build, which is built on a pretty cheap ATI kit on a cheap lower receiver. The trigger has cycled around some different guns and is currently in my ATI Milsport 9mm pistol, which is actually kind of coincidental. This trigger is really quite fast, and you'll see that in the video. The issue that I encountered with this trigger is that with the 3.5 pound spring, I was getting a lot of hammer follow. And when I reached out to Geissele about it, what they told me is more experienced shooters tend to feather the trigger, which means you're kind of riding the trigger forward as it resets and then inadvertently pull it again before the bolt is all the way seated forward. So what they recommended I do is replace the spring with a 4.5 power spring. Now, the rapid fire trigger is on the budget end, but the trade-off with that is the trigger is a little bit grittier than the other triggers that I'm going to talk about in this selection. And while it is fast, for me, the trade-off of having to put a 4.5 pound spring in means that the trigger is actually a lot tougher to pull. 4.5 is still not a bad pull at all, but compared to the 3.5 pound of the other two triggers, it's definitely a lot more noticeable. The SSP is a much more traditional single stage trigger, so think something like you might have on a mil-spec AR. But the difference here is that with the break being front loaded, there is no perceptible take up or creep to me. So like with the rapid fire, has a very short reset and it is very fast, but the difference is it has a very positive reset, and then of course the break is right in the front of the trigger. It's not as fast as the rapid fire, but I also find it to be a little bit more consistent, and it's still plenty fast. Now, the third and last trigger that I have here is the S3G, what Geissele calls a hybrid trigger, what most manufacturers, retailers have on their sites listed as a single stage trigger. The hybrid trigger with the S3G effectively means that you have a little small amount of take-up before the hammer goes forward. But unlike on a two-stage trigger, there is no wall. So you start to pull the trigger to the rear, and then the hammer goes forward at some point while the trigger is in rearward motion. So that means it's not as precise as a two-stage, but as Geissele explains, the reason why this makes it for a fast action trigger is the pressure to pull that trigger rearward is the same pressure pushing against your finger when the trigger resets. So it's a very smooth and very consistent backwards to engage the trigger and forwards to reset the trigger. When you combine that with generally a pretty lightweight pull and a relatively short reset, it makes for a very speedy trigger for follow-up shots. It's kind of hard to articulate exactly what it is. If you pulled it out of the box for the very first time and didn't understand the thought process and the engineering behind it, you might call that little bit of take-up creep, except there is no grit. Unlike with the rapid fire, there is no grit or inconsistency in how that trigger moves to the rear. So it's almost kind of a surprising break. As someone who's used to shooting AKs, that sort of mysterious breaking point is something I'm very used to, and I tend to find that I'm much faster with an out-of-the-box factory AK trigger than I am with a factory out-of-the-box AR trigger. So of the three, it's hard to say which one that I like the best. I tend to want to say the SSP because I typically expect that wall for the break to be right in the front of the trigger instead of a little bit back. I do think I might be a little bit faster with the S3G, but I hope that helped you kind of see the differences between these three triggers. It's hard to get any sense or feel without actually, like I said, getting your finger on it and trying it. So one additional footnote is I did swap the S3G and the SSP in the 601 in the BRN10A. I put the S3G in the BRN10A and discovered that the BRN10A started failing every few rounds, failing to eject. It seemed like maybe there was some recoil energy being robbed on the bolt carrier, but after I swapped back with the SSP and put the SSP back in it, it seemed to run just fine. It had one more failure to eject like in the second round, and then I put another 100 rounds through it without issue. So I'm not sure if that's something specific with this trigger and gun combination or what exactly, but because we got it on camera, I thought I would mention it. The S3G is purported to run with AR10s, but with this being a reproduction and plus there being so little consistency from AR10 to AR10, there's no telling exactly what happened here with the S3G and the BRN10A, but runs just fine with the SSP. Hope you liked this video. If you did, please click like. Be sure to subscribe to us if you haven't already, and be sure to check out the link to our Patreon page if you're interested in helping support us. This is Jay, and I will see you again soon next time.